As you know, hot work operations are amongst the most hazardous operations on board ships. Our aim in this video is to refresh your memory of the general procedures used to reduce risk and manage hot work. In order to control risks, every instance is controlled by the Permit to Work system, described in your vessel's SMS. These procedures lead personnel through the process and ensure that all safety concerns are satisfactorily addressed before work begins. The SMS will designate safe spaces to routinely carry out hot work, one of which is the engine room workshop. But any operations taking place outside these spaces will be subject to a hot work permit. The SMS will also give guidance on when hot work might be permitted, though terminal or other national laws will take precedence. Ultimately, the master decides whether hot work is justified and can be done safely. Your vessel's SMS will ensure an authorized person is responsible to assess risk, authorize the permit, and validate its completion or closure. They will also establish the terms on which the permit may remain valid. Sometimes referred to as the responsible person, they should not be directly involved in the work. It is their job to ensure the plan is followed by those who are executing it. The hot work system will also identify a competent person to act as the permit holder when it is active. Both roles must be clearly identified for each permit. A permit form has a number of sections that must be completed. The amount varies from company to company. During the daily SMT meeting, certain operations are identified, along with the scope of the work, what other permits and certificates are active or required, and how the work requested will interface with the safety of other operations.
Of the maintenance systems. We plan to do some hot work on the forecastle too, and the fitter will do the work, of course. So you guys assist him as good as you can.
Here, the task is to replace a temporary step in the vessel's forecastle for a more permanent arrangement. The work involves fabricating and attaching a step. In this case, welding equipment will be required. At this point, the first part of the ship's hot work permit procedure is completed, and the scope of the work has been fully outlined. As part of the permit procedure, management work planning meetings are used to initiate risk assessments and discuss their findings. They help to identify the work permits required, the control measures to be implemented, including any safety briefings, toolbox talks, and work procedures, and the personnel and equipment needed for the operation. When it is decided that work can go ahead, it is essential that hot work risks are assessed by suitably qualified and experienced personnel, both at the work site and in any surrounding or adjacent spaces. The risk assessment will identify hazards related to the hot work activity, decide what harm may be caused, and determine the risk and action required to reduce it to an acceptable level. Hot work has many associated risks, including explosions that can damage equipment, the vessel, and personnel. The second section of the permit checks that effective risk assessment and hazard control is in place before the task is started. In this section, the Permit to Work identifies the control measures that the pre-task risk assessment procedure has identified for this job. These must be checked and in place before the authorized person signs the permit. Tanks and pipelines must be gas-free and approved for hot work on or close by. Adjacent tanks must also be certified gas-free or filled with water. Checks must be made for combustible materials directly above, below, and around the workplace, and the area should be relatively dry to prevent electrical shocks. There are other sources of instruction that must be considered, including work instruction, procedures to be followed, any local limitations, and checklists of safety equipment required at the job location. The operator should be competent in the process, familiar with the equipment used, and instructed where special precautions should be taken. The control measures implemented as a result of the risk assessment must reduce residual risk to as low as reasonably practicable. To do this, we must reduce the likelihood of the event occurring or reduce its consequences. As hot work accidents can be catastrophic, our primary goal is to reduce the likelihood of one occurring. The simplest ways to do this are to limit the amount of hot work and to decrease the number of times the task can be undertaken, such as prohibiting hot work during cargo operations. The hot work permit system reduces likelihood by implementing physical or procedural barriers. All 6 sides of a space or compartment are checked, with hazards removed or controlled. Gas-freeing spaces is also an essential control measure. To be gas-free, a space must be tested and free from hazardous concentrations of any gas. For any space to be considered safe for hot work, ISCOT requires the space to have less than 1% LFL of hydrocarbon gas. Adjacent spaces must also be tested. On board tankers, the likelihood of accidents can be reduced by inerting adjacent spaces where possible. Specific recommendations and limitations on where hot work can take place can be found in ISCOT. For welding operations, readying fire curtains and blankets to contain welding sparks will reduce the chance of an accident, while the use of insulating mats or boards can reduce the risk of electric shock when working in confined or restricted areas, or in close contact with the ship's structure. Another potential risk is delayed fires, which creates the need to check the workspace and surrounding spaces after the operation has been completed. These should be continued for as long as required by the risk assessment procedure. Even when these measures are put in place, control measures are required to reduce the consequences of any possible accidents. Personnel should wear the necessary PPE and they should be briefed on the actions to take in each of these cases. Using hot work scenarios in drills is a good way to prepare crews. The risk assessment may also identify the need to have personnel standing by in firefighting gear, with the main and emergency fire pumps started and charged, and the fire hoses led close to the space. Additional fire extinguishers should be placed in or adjacent to the space. Boundary calling of adjacent space bulkheads is another way to reduce the consequences of an accident. In order to reduce the consequences of pollution, the ship's anti-pollution equipment must also be readied for immediate deployment. ISCOT sets out a number of minimum requirements to ensure hot work is carried out safely on tankers. This includes ensuring that hot work outside of the designated spaces only ever takes place during a ballast voyage, when the tanks and spaces surrounding the hot work area must be thoroughly cleaned and gas-freed with hydrocarbon vapor reduced to not more than 1% LFL within a minimum radius of the work area. Tanks within 30 meters of where the work is to be carried out should be gas-freed. All non-gas-free cargo tanks should be purged and maintained at not more than 2% volume hydrocarbons. Cargo and inert gas distribution pipelines to the cargo tank, containing slops, must be isolated from the rest of the cargo tanks. This provides a gas-free barrier around the tanks where the work is being performed. When hot work is on top of cargo tanks, within 500 millimeters of the deck, the tank beneath and the adjacent cargo tanks need to be water washed and gas-freed to the required hot work standard. Specific recommendations and limitations on where hot work can take place can be found in ISCOT. For repairs inside the bunker tank, it must be cleaned and gas-freed, with hot work and enclosed space permits in place. Heating coils must be flushed or blown through with steam, and the atmosphere must be tested as gas-free before any hot work. The third section of the hot work permit deals with validation and authorization. Each vessel has procedures that must be followed before work is authorized and started. Once the risk assessment has taken place and the competent person is satisfied that work is safe to start, they must seek permission from the authorized person. This will be the master or chief engineer, but company procedures may require additional authority from a superintendent or other authorized person in the office. If the vessel is in port, other agencies may also need to be approached. A period of validity will be added to the permit, determined by the risk assessment and the company SMS. The period of validity is always short, and the work must not continue outside the time stated. If they give their consent for work to commence, the authorized person will sign the permit, and the competent person is then able to accept responsibility for the operation. Immediately before hot work is started, the authorized person should examine the area where it is to be undertaken. They must ensure the firefighting equipment in place is adequate and meets the requirements identified. Gas tests must show less than 1% LFL and that the space is otherwise gas-free. The authorized person will establish the frequency of atmosphere monitoring and that the area is continuously monitored. Work must follow the times stated on the permit, the approved procedures, and any considerations specific to a vessel's location. However, risk assessments should not stop when the permit has been authorized. It is essential to monitor potential risks throughout the operation. If conditions change, the job should stop until these are restored, or another risk assessment is carried out and a new permit is issued. If the atmosphere changes so that it is outside permissible limits, hot work must stop and not be restarted until all safety precautions have been rechecked and a new permit has been issued. The final section is the end of work declaration, or job completion verification and approval. When the work is finished, or it can't be continued, the competent person must confirm that all the people involved have been withdrawn and warned that it is no longer safe to continue. The equipment must also be removed. The authorized person then signs off the permit, indicating whether or not the work has been completed. The permit only authorizes the competent person to work under certain conditions for a period of time. A new permit must be obtained to continue any incomplete work. Now that the permit has been signed off, the original copy should be filed as required by your company's SMS. We all know the risks associated with hot work and the importance of implementing control measures to minimize these risks. Let's take a look back on some of the main points covered in this module. First, we learned that your vessel's SMS will contain the procedures required to minimize risks associated with hot work to as low as reasonably practicable. This will include assigning an authorized person to ensure the plan is followed and a competent person who acts as a permit holder when it is active. Next, we saw that the first section of the hot work permit is used to outline the scope of the work required. The next step is to assess the worksite and adjacent spaces for risks and identify any hazards and the amount of harm that may be caused, so that appropriate control measures can be introduced to reduce the likelihood or potential consequences of an accident. The third section of the permit to work system is validation and authorization. This must be completed before work starts. If the conditions change from those outlined in the permit, work must stop until conditions are restored or a new risk assessment is carried out with a new permit issued. When the work is finished or cannot be continued, the permit should be signed off by the authorized person and then filed as required by the SMS. Any hot work operation on board has hazards associated with it, but with appropriate preparation and supervision, risks can be managed to ensure safe and effective operations.